There's a photograph in the basement archives of the New York Public Library that nobody talks about. It was cataloged in 1934, donated by the estate of a commercial photographer named William Brackett. The image shows the interior of a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. The date stamped on the reverse, written in Brackett's own hand, reads April 1862. The women in the photograph are standing at their stations. Rows of power looms stretch behind them into the depth of the frame, and mounted on the wall, just visible over the shoulder of the third woman from the left, is a device that looks exactly like an electric distribution panel. Not similar to, not reminiscent of, identical in form and function to the kind of electrical panel box that wouldn't appear in American factories until the 1890s and wouldn't become standard industrial equipment until after 1910. I found this photograph by accident. I wasn't looking for it. I was researching labor conditions in Civil War-era textile production, and I needed visual documentation of the factory floor layout. The Brackett collection had 17 images from Lowell mills between 1861 and 1863. 16 of them showed exactly what I expected. The 17th showed something that has no business being there. The panel is small, mounted at roughly shoulder height. It has a hinged cover, partially open in the photograph. Inside, you can see what appear to be separate compartments arranged vertically. The resolution isn't perfect, but the structure is clear enough. Compartmentalized electrical distribution, the kind used to separate circuits and prevent system-wide failure when one line overloads, was not developed until the 1880s. It was not commercially manufactured until the early 1900s, and it absolutely should not exist in a photograph from April 1862. When I brought this to the attention of the archive staff, the response was polite and careful. The panel on the wall could be anything: a tool cabinet, a mail sorting box, some piece of period-appropriate equipment that only looked like electrical infrastructure because I was viewing it with modern assumptions. That explanation would be fine if this were the only photograph, but it's not. The Boston Waterworks, 1867. The Boston Public Library holds a collection of municipal infrastructure photographs taken between 1865 and 1870. One photograph, dated March 1867, shows the interior of the Brookline pump station. In the center of the frame is the primary steam engine. On the left side, mounted on the brick wall approximately 8 feet above the floor, is a series of identical cylindrical objects arranged in a horizontal line. They look like PVC pipes. Polyvinyl chloride was not invented until 1872, and even then, it existed only as a laboratory curiosity. PVC pipe, the kind used in plumbing and industrial fluid systems, was not commercially produced until 1936. The objects in the 1867 photograph are smooth-surfaced, uniform in diameter, light in color, and run in a perfectly straight line along the wall with visible junction points at regular intervals. The official explanation is that these are wooden conduit pipes, painted white. The smoothness is attributed to quality craftsmanship, the uniformity to precision manufacturing. But wooden pipes, even painted, photographed in the 1860s, do not look like that. What grain shows through paint in wet plate photography. The chemistry of the process records texture with brutal honesty, and I've seen dozens of photographs of 19th century wooden pipe systems. They all show visible texture. They all show joints that don't match the clean, threaded-looking connections in the Brookline photograph. More importantly, the explanation does not cite any contemporary documentation confirming that the Brookline station used wooden conduit. It cites the photograph itself as evidence that wooden pipe must have been used, because what else could those objects be? That's circular reasoning, and it's the same pattern I kept finding. The language of patents. When an inventor files a patent for something genuinely new, the language reflects that. The application describes a novel apparatus for or an invention whereby. The claims are broad because there's no prior art to navigate around. When an inventor files for an improvement on existing technology, the language shifts to an improvement on the known method of or refinement of existing apparatus for. Between 1895 and 1925, the U.S. Patent Office approved thousands of patents related to industrial electrical systems, mechanical automation, and chemical manufacturing. I've read several hundred of them. Full documents, not abstracts. The overwhelming majority use improvement language. They describe refinements to existing electric motor designs, improvements on known methods of automated assembly, modifications to establish chemical synthesis processes. The language assumes the existence of prior technology. But when you trace backward, looking for the original patents, the foundational inventions that these improvements are supposedly refining, you hit a wall. The earlier patents either don't exist, or they're filed by inventors whose names have been erased from the historical record, whose work was bought, consolidated, or legally suppressed during the patent wars of the 1880s and 1890s. There's a patent filed in 1904 by an engineer named Simon Ingersoll that explicitly describes the design as an improvement upon the existing compressed air distribution networks in use in textile manufacturing and metalworking facilities. Existing networks. In 1904. So where's the original patent for those networks? Who designed them? When were they installed? The Patent Office Index doesn't show a clear predecessor. But Ingersoll's language is unambiguous. He's not inventing the system. He's making it better. Either the patent attorneys were lying, which invites rejection and legal challenge, or the methods they were improving already existed and simply aren't in the version of history that survived. The Philadelphia Navy Yard, 1863. The National Archives holds complete photographic documentation of U.S. Navy shipbuilding facilities during the Civil War. Among these is a series from the Philadelphia Navy Yard, dated between August 1862 and November 1863, showing construction of a USS Kalamazoo. 3 photographs show the interior of the fabrication shop, where iron plating was cut and shaped. In the background of all 3 images behind the work crews, you can see a large cylindrical tank mounted horizontally on a brick foundation. Pipes extend from both ends. A pressure gauge is visible on the top surface. It looks exactly like a compressed air reservoir. Compressed air systems were being experimented with in the 1860s. Robert Fairbairn in England was working on compressed air engines for mining. But these were experimental, one-off installations, not standard factory equipment, and certainly not in American naval shipyards, which were still operating primarily on steam power. Yet there it is, a horizontal pneumatic reservoir tank with distribution piping, photographed in a U.S. military facility in 1863. The official equipment inventories from this period list steam engines, boilers, mechanical hammers, and hand tools. Nothing about pneumatic power. I submitted a formal research inquiry to the Naval History and Heritage Command. The response took 4 months. No such documentation existed in the catalog records, but equipment inventories from the period were incomplete due to wartime record-keeping practices. Incomplete records. That phrase shows up constantly. Whenever there's a gap between what photographs show and what official documents say, the explanation is always incomplete records, lost documentation, wartime chaos, always something that can't be verified because the original proof doesn't exist anymore. The fire pattern. A significant percentage of photographic and documentary evidence from the 1850s to 1880s that might verify pre-official invention dates for various technologies was destroyed by fire. The Chicago fire of 1871 destroyed multiple photography studios that held original glass plate negatives of the city's industrial infrastructure. The Boston fire of 1872 wiped out archives of several engineering firms that had worked on municipal projects during the 1860s. The Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876 had its administrative records stored in a warehouse that burned in 1881. What survived were published reports and newspaper coverage. The internal documentation, the technical specifications, the private correspondence between exhibitors and organizers is gone. And it's not just fires. The U.S. Patent Office had a systematic purge in 1870 of duplicate and obsolete materials. What qualified as duplicate? What qualified as obsolete? Those decisions were made by clerks whose names aren't recorded. How many early patents describing technologies before they were officially invented were thrown away as irrelevant duplicates? We don't know. The records of what was purged don't exist. The 1876 Centennial Exhibition. The United States Centennial International Exhibition was held in Philadelphia from May to November 1876. 37 nations participated. Nearly 10 million people attended. Machinery Hall alone covered 14 acres. The exhibition was extensively photographed. In multiple wide-angle shots of Machinery Hall's interior, you can see electrical wiring, not telegraph wire, not experimental arc lighting demonstrations, distribution wiring, insulated cables running along the ceiling structure in parallel lines, with junction boxes at regular intervals, branching off to individual stations. This is 3 years before Edison demonstrated a practical light bulb, 7 years before the first commercial electrical grid. The standard response is that these are pneumatic air lines. But pneumatic lines don't require junction boxes every 15 feet. They don't branch in the specific pattern that electrical distribution uses. And if these were pneumatic lines, why isn't that documented in the official exhibition reports? The reports describe the coreless engine in exhaustive detail. They document every steam-powered demonstration. Compressed air distribution would have been notable enough to mention, but it's not mentioned. The overhead infrastructure is simply not discussed. What is discussed repeatedly in newspaper coverage is how well-lit Machinery Hall was. Contemporary accounts describe steady and bright illumination without the flicker of gas or the smoke of oil lamps. Philadelphia Inquirer, June 1876. The hall was as bright as midday, with none of the yellow tint of gas flame. What was producing that light? The inventor who saw it twice. Lewis Howard Latimer is recognized today for improving the carbon filament manufacturing process that made Edison's bulbs commercially viable. But his biography contains something most summaries skip. By age 18, he was working as a draftsman in a patent attorney's office in Boston, creating technical drawings for patent applications. Between 1866 and 1876, Latimer worked on hundreds of applications. He saw designs of devices years away from commercial production. In an interview published in 1921, Latimer mentioned that he had drafted applications for electrical distribution systems in 1871 and 1872, not theoretical systems, working systems already operational in private industrial facilities, whose owners were seeking patent protection for improvements. Then in 1876, Latimer attended the Centennial Exhibition. He walked through Machinery Hall and recognized configurations, equipment arrangements that matched patent drawings he had prepared years before, installed and operational, with no credit given to people who had filed those early applications. He went to work for Edison in the 1880s. His name appears on several Edison Company patents, but he spent his career drawing systems that someone else would be credited with inventing, including systems he'd already drawn once before under someone else's name. In private notes donated to the Schomburg Center decades after his death, Latimer kept a list, just names and dates. Inventors he'd worked with, patents he'd drafted, technologies he'd seen demonstrated before their official invention date. The list includes electrical distribution panels in 1871, automated assembly conveyor systems in 1873, industrial refrigeration units in 1875. None of those technologies officially existed yet, but Latimer drew them. He saw them working, and then he watched other people invent them again 10 years later. What's actually being claimed here? I am not claiming the 19th century had modern technology. I'm claiming something much narrower, that certain specific technologies which we date to the 1890s to 1920s based on patent records and commercial introduction were actually demonstrated and operationally deployed in limited contexts during the 1860s and 1870s. The gap between demonstration and commercialization was much longer than the official history suggests, and the early demonstration phase has been systematically erased. Why? Not conspiracy. Capitalism. The inventors who successfully commercialized these technologies had every incentive to present their work as original invention rather than commercial refinement. Original invention gets you broader patent protection, heroic press coverage, better stock valuation. So the earlier work gets buried, not actively suppressed, just not mentioned, not included in company histories. And over time, as early inventors die and their documents are lost to fire or estate sales or administrative purging, the later version becomes the only version. The photographs remain because they weren't considered important enough to destroy. The questions being avoided. The Smithsonian could commission a comprehensive review of industrial age photography, specifically analyzing technological artifacts and backgrounds, not the intended subjects, the backgrounds. The Patent Office could cross-reference improvement patents from 1890 to 1920, with earlier filings to trace actual development timelines instead of just recording commercial winners. The Library of Congress could compile a database of lost archive collections, tracking what documentation existed before fires and purges. None of these projects have been undertaken, not because they're impossible, because the questions they'd answer aren't considered important. But those questions change who we remember, and they change how we think about invention itself. Because if these photographs show what I think they show, then invention isn't a sudden breakthrough we celebrate. It's a slow, grinding process where the same idea gets demonstrated repeatedly by different people until finally someone with enough money and luck turns it into a business that survives. The first person to demonstrate it doesn't matter. Only the last one does. And everyone before that, they're just ghosts in the background of photographs, standing next to equipment that officially doesn't exist yet. There was a machinist in 1920 who was old enough to have worked in Lowell in 1862, old enough to have visited the Centennial Exhibition in 1876, old enough to remember what the factories looked like before the official electrical age began. What did he say when he read that electric distribution panels were invented in the 1890s? Did he try to correct the record? Or did he just shrug, knowing no one would believe him? Because the photographs that could prove he was right were filed in archives where no one was looking. The archives are still there. The photographs haven't changed. We just have to be willing to see what's actually there, not what the timeline says should be there. What is there?